Welcome back to another episode of COVID-19 from crisis to creation here on Mentorit TV. I'm Patricia Falco Beccalli. Well, today we're going to look at the future of democracy, the future of capitalism, and does COVID-19 really change those two fundamental pillars of our society? Today's very special guest, Nik Gowing, is going to join us to debate, especially the unthinkable that seems to have happened. Before introducing him to the conversation, let me just give you a bit of a background of Nik Gowing. It should be really a name, a staple name, somebody you should have seen already on BBC World, where he was the main anchor of the news for many, many years. Not only that, he's a big expert in politics, foreign affairs, diplomacy, certainly featured on ITN. He's a speaker and an author. And today I'm welcoming him as the founder of Thinking The Unthinkable. Nik, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Patricia. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, listen, let's dive straight into it. Thinking the Unthinkable is described as a management consultancy, but it is so much more. It really is a good guide, a lead up, a preparation for management today, what they should think about outside of their day-to-day operations. Tell us a little bit more about Thinking the Unthinkable.
Yes, it's not a management consultancy. When I stopped being a television anchor 6 years ago, I could see that things were changing. Putin was doing dreadful things in Ukraine. He was then seizing Crimea. The very nature of the stability we'd taken for granted, particularly since after the Second World War, was up for grabs. Now, you may say, well, kind of we know that now, but I, when I was leaving the BBC, realized something big was happening. A new normal was developing. Now, we've been through the migration crisis, the Brexit crisis, dare I say the Trump crisis, what is happening now in Hungary, what's happening in Poland, what's happening in Brazil. Many of the assumptions we're making about stability are no longer valid. Now, that was all before COVID-19. And we, through our work, and that is the indicative of it, is, and you've got one too, thank you.
A signed copy by you. Very proud of this one. Fascinating read, yes.
I'll sign it for anybody. But this image is what matters. It came from Chatham House, the International Royal Institute for International Affairs in London, where 23 days before the Brexit vote, we predicted that Brexit would be voted for, that Trump would be nominated and Trump would be elected. And people thought we were smoking something. But look, this is about leaders who are blindfold to the reality of what is happening. 3 years later, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, former British Prime Minister, said, quote, "I'm sorry, I failed." So this is about leaders who, by being leaders, you assume they know everything, they think everything, but they're not thinking enough. Of course, if you're thinking the unthinkable, then you can't do that because you can't think the unthinkable. But a more precise definition is thinking the unpalatable. The evidence is out there. The evidence is out there big time. We knew a pandemic was on its way.
Yes.
But no one really wanted to believe it. Now look what's happened.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a very interesting point you're making. Okay, not the unthinkable, but our leadership should think about the unpalatable, but not only think about it, but also mention it. But isn't that really what blocks any kind of popularity to your leadership going forward? And is this why leaders may feel more reluctant to really raise this kind of issues that we've seen, be it Brexit, be it the oil price below zero, be it Trump being elected or re-elected, potentially?
There's an inherent tension here. And we, in our work, before COVID, I should say, 3-4 years ago, we interview and still are interviewing an incredible number of very top people, privately, confidentially. And they said they are scared and overwhelmed by the enormity of the pressures on them. One likened it to trying to eat an elephant in one mouthful because the pressures on leaders are so enormous. This is about, as the director of the Institute for Statecraft, Chris Donnelly, told us, this is now like a wartime where institutions can't handle this, where people at the top don't want to handle it in the way that's necessary. And if you're working as a public servant, or you're working as a senior executive for people at the top, they believe they know best. And if you, with your understanding and intuition of and insight into what is happening, realize something is happening, want to tell your boss that he doesn't or she doesn't want to listen, then it's a career limiting move potentially. So what you've got is constraints. within systems. And our main finding before COVID-19 was the following: the conformity which qualifies leaders for the top disqualifies them from understanding the enormity of what is happening, the scale of disruption, the implications, and then what on earth to do about it. So you've got a degree of myopia, you've got a degree of control freakery. And because leaders believe that they've been elected, they've been nominated, they've been appointed through headhunters, they must know best. Quite often they don't anymore. And that carries a very, very high price. And we were saying that before COVID. And most people, certainly in Europe, were not prepared to believe that something which started in China and went on through Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, and so on, would end up with the enormity that we're now seeing. So certainly the United Kingdom, where I come from, there's now real pressure on the government saying, why didn't you do much more, much sooner? Well, they thought they could wing it. They thought they could get away with it. And that's the same in Italy. It's the same in Spain. It's the same in several other European countries.
Yes. So, coming to democracy in general and how this kind of political system really is mapping out and whether it is adapted to handle a crisis. Democracy is all about voting, as you were saying. So we're living in a Western society. We vote for a leader. We expect this leader to have the intelligence, i.e. data. And as soon as the data is there, perhaps about a pandemic that is about to happen, to inform us, to prepare us, and to then not handle it just haphazardly, as it seems to be the case right now, better or worse in different countries, but to be prepared and say, yeah, we saw it coming. Why is that not happening?
What you've got, and you certainly saw it in the United Kingdom during Brexit, but overarching is the fact that politics and politicians don't understand the enormity of change, do not understand, and that was before COVID. In February of last year, 2019, I was invited to Rome to address 60 politicians from 27 European member nations. And we were saying, how much are you thinking the unthinkable? Most people wanted me out of the room. They didn't believe what I was saying because I said, this is going to impact on you as the political class and your ability to get elected, because you've got to understand that the public is seeing things in a very different way. Now, what we've seen certainly in the United Kingdom is an attempt to form political parties. I know in Germany, there's real concern right from the speaker president downwards, Wolfgang Schäuble, that really the political class don't get the enormity of what is happening, yet the public expects them to be able to have the answers, the solutions, and to act in a timely way. I think what you're seeing is a disconnect now. There will probably be a political price that many governments are going to have to pay in the coming months and years. And I come from a country where, after all, Churchill helped led the victory against Hitler. He was voted out immediately afterwards in the 1945 election. Look what's happening in Hungary at the moment with Viktor Orban, who is essentially trying to say, I'm in charge, vote for me because I will keep control. Same with Poland now with Kaczynski. So what you're seeing is a realignment of politics and at the same time putting up of barriers within the European Union. I think even the European Union dream and fundamental federal attempt to produce something of seismic unity within Europe is now under real threat, because what you've seen in a matter of days and weeks recently is barriers going up between every one of the 27 nations. That is going to be very difficult to change. That is about a new nationalism, and certainly I've heard economists in the last few days talking about the real challenge now, which is that the political class don't get it, and therefore there'll be an urgency to finding new solutions. But as we're seeing in Italy and elsewhere, populist parties are not doing very well now, because actually populists don't make good governments. So it's a real paradox, but politicians will have been seen to fail because they didn't act in a timely enough way.
And the paradox is something that I want to talk to you about, Nick, because Chatham House, you just mentioned that one as well. There was a very interesting article about the coronavirus and the future of democracy. And I quote, if you let me, there has been already a lot of discussions about whether authoritarian states will emerge stronger from this crisis than democracies. What do you say?
I don't think either is the case, because I think there is sufficient backlash in a place like the People's Republic of China, which will make them have to think hard about the way they maintain consensus. President Xi has already made clear he wants fuller control. But I think there could quite easily be some kind of backlash, which will require potentially the 86 million people of the Communist Party to really assert their superiority. Does it mean the end of democracy? I would say democracy is, in fact, President Putin gave an interview, I think it was to the Financial Times a few months ago, in which he said he saw the end of the liberal state. I don't see that at all. Democracy is about people having their voice, and therefore those who represent those who want a voice actually being heard, even if it's within political parties. What I do think, though, which is shifting the ground of your question a little bit, is the following. And I come from a country where we have essentially a deep right-wing government which believes in Brexit and so on, but a deep right-wing government which is having to essentially involve itself now in state support for the economy. So, and this is not the perfect.
It doesn't make sense. I know exactly what you mean, and I think what is interesting here is you said liberal democracy. I mean, we do have liberal democracy.
Putin saw the end of the liberal democracy.
Okay. You know. The end, but the concept of liberal democracy and drilling a little bit deeper and going in a little bit more detail. So we have liberal democracies usually in countries where there's an old democracy. And then you have something you could describe as illiberal democracy in places such as Singapore or some of the Asian states. So where you have on one hand, you have the voters, the democracy, but should there be something that needs to be managed by the government, that's okay. And perhaps the adaptation of the Asian countries much faster to the restrictions, to the lockdowns that were imposed by the government were followed faster than, for example, in Switzerland or even in the UK, where we had a very liberal approach. So that I think is also an interesting distinction to make.
Well, I've been in touch with Singapore. I've been a visiting professor there until last year. And I was in touch with several leading people recently. The PAP, the governing party there, had a shock in 2011 when the country turned against it. It didn't lose power, but turned against it. And there is a fear that their handling of the coronavirus could lead to the same kind of backlash. They are now onto their fourth wave of COVID-19 in ways which is really frightening them. And the expectation is that the public always has faith by the nature of Singapore in its leadership. They're not sure if they still have faith in their leadership. But let me take this one stage further, because I think we're using potentially the wrong language, the wrong definitions. You talk about liberal democracy, democracy authoritarianism. The point I was going to go on to make is the following. What you're seeing is a form of socialist capitalism in a place like Britain. Literally hundreds of billions of pounds being spent on keeping the economy afloat. That is not capitalism as we know it.
Yeah,
there is now real pressure in many countries for inequality in the gig economy to be tackled, because people expect that they will be looked after by the state. And therefore, it could be, and this is what I've heard from several economists already, a shift away from the gig economy, the 0 hours economy, the full capitalistic economy, into wanting to have faith and confidence that the state will look after you, which means a different form of politics. Now, that's why I say, careful, we may have the wrong definitions here. It's the party which will be offering a form of socialist capitalism, which could do well. That's not the end of capitalism, but in this country, for example, the railway system, we have had until very recently railway franchises owned by capitalist organizations. They've had to be taken into state ownership simply because otherwise the trains wouldn't run anymore. So there's an end of globalization potentially.
Yeah.
There's an end to all the kind of spirit and ideology of the right wing potentially, which could lead to a backlash which creates a different kind of politics. I think that's open for discussion.
Yeah, let me challenge you on the social part of capitalism. And now we're moving into the second issue I would love to, or we are discussing today. And that is, now what we're seeing, what is happening, like in the crisis in 2008, what we're seeing is all these bailouts, government help, government liquidity, the central banks pumping in money just to cover the potential economic crisis that we are definitely, that we are seeing is unfolding in front of our eyes. We don't know how quick we are going to recover. However, I wonder, couldn't there be a difference between just pumping liquidity versus really having a structure of where to invest, as you were saying about the railways, for example. So, and some sort of conditionality as well to, okay, we'll give you the money, but please, corporation, please, state, you have to employ it in a certain way that you preserve work, that you continue to invest in R&D, that you do everything in terms of creating a better future, economically speaking as well. So the capitalist idea of just making anything for pure gain starts being a little bit more human.
But in all of this, there's another issue, which is debt. The level of debt which is now being accumulated by every government, handing out enormous, including in Switzerland, handing out incredible handouts, often unconditionally. We're talking about tens and hundreds of billions of euros, francs, pounds, dollars, yuan, it doesn't matter which currency. What is going to happen next? In order to pay that back, will there then have to be austerity? Well, if you're trying to regenerate wealth in a stagnant, depressed economy, you don't then introduce austerity. You actually have to stimulate demand, which means the government spending more money. And that's why I'm suggesting to you that something big could potentially have to happen, not be happening, have to happen. That those of the right who believe that their capitalism and their capitalistic instincts should be upheld will have to accept that in order to create demand and expenditure and consumption, they've got to keep pumping money in, when, as we've seen in Britain, it's been an incredibly tough 10 years. We've been through austerity, austerity, austerity. Austerity will then create exactly the kind of problems you're trying to avoid. And this requires a new level of thinking the unthinkable. And economists have no model for this. No one knows what to do. What's the point? And we're only talking about the developed world here, Patricia. What about in the developing world, where they have no cash resources? What do? They throw money out of helicopters, metaphorically, as is beginning to happen in the big Western democracies, the developed countries. That money will end up in the hands of the corrupt officials. It won't end up in the pockets of the people who really need it. And so we're talking about essentially an implosion of economic assumptions we've always taken for granted, which is about economic wealth and things getting better. That's going to be a tough thing to swallow.
Yeah, if nothing else, I wonder about thinking the unthinkable and debt relief. I mean, you're mentioning the government debt, but I'm looking only at the US, for example, household debt above 14 billion US dollar was the last number I came across. And now we're, of course, handing out to businesses what they call a stimulus package. But what it is really, hey, you have to pay the money back. Sooner or later, you will have to pay the money back. Will they be able? Is that enough to stimulate the economy that one day these businesses, even in 5 years' time, even at zero interest, will be able to pay back? Same thing, the contagion you're talking about in emerging markets from the developed markets. Is there not a haircut needed? And we had that discussion over and over again. I'm sure you remember in 2008, all these countries, European countries, getting let off of their debt. Would that be thinking the unthinkable and just say, okay, let's reboot, unplug even the economy and just get a level playing field and then start building again?
I think that's what going to have to be on the agenda, and it's certainly part of the discussions I've been hearing, listening to webinars. I'm getting more access to senior people than I think I've ever had for a long time, just by sitting in my study. But it is remarkable. And debt relief or debt write-off, most certainly. There's no model for it, apart from in the 1930s, maybe. But look, the IMF and the World Bank didn't exist then. They were created in the Second World War to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen. Remember, this is not a great financial crisis, a GFC. This is a crisis created by a disease, an epidemiological wave, which all of us, whether we're rich or poor, are vulnerable to.
Yes.
And I think that, for a lot of people in the professions, quite apart from people who are just low skilled workers, it's tough, because if you're a lawyer, if you're an accountant, if you're a barrister, you still got to earn money to pay off the mortgage and send your kids to school, and that's going to be really tough for a lot.
Yeah, and I think the trade-off, exactly. The trade-off here is really you're saving lives on a healthcare level, but livelihoods because of that are increasingly in danger. And I wonder, coming through coming also to the issue of social unrest, Nick, you alluded to a little bit earlier on. I mean, we are looking at these demonstrations at the moment every day in the US, where people are going out onto the streets, say, open up the economy, we just need to make money, the funds are not being followed through quickly enough, we are hungry. Now, question, is that a sign of democracy at work, where everybody can just demonstrate and fight for their rights? Or is that the beginning of social unrest, which could really balloon into something rather more dangerous?
I'm not sure. Look, we on page 211 in our book, we quote Joe Kaeser, the current global CEO of Siemens, warning about exactly this. And that was 2 years ago, that the glue which holds society together will become unstuck. I think that that was because of the digital revolution, the banking, everything else, that this is about something else. This is about health. I think there's an understanding that gathering and taking the risk of some kind of societal protest will not probably have the impact that is being hoped for, because ultimately this is beyond protest for it to have an impact. This is about something else. And I think, even though we can disagree about how we got here, I think most governments are acting as decisively as the public expect, even if some of the technical issues of some of the schemes are not to everyone's liking. But that's only going to keep us going for 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
What happens in August and September, if there's a second and third wave,
Yeah.
and the lockdowns have to be continued or have to be reimposed? This is about a societal level of potential freeze. Wealth is created by people spending money. If people are not spending money,
Yes.
then actually there's a problem. I don't know about you,
Yeah.
but apart from 1 or 2 things I might buy, but not online these days, I'm not spending any money.
Same here.
So,
Yeah.
apart from going to the shops. And so the whole multiplier effect, which generates wealth, is grinding to a halt. You live near Zurich Airport, one of the main hubs of the airline business, Lufthansa,
Yes.
in Europe. Look how many planes are not flying. Lufthansa, virtually 760 planes, almost all of them on the ground. Almost all British Airways planes on the ground. You have to be asking, what's going to happen with these airlines?
Yes.
People who imagine they can get on Wizz Air, EasyJet and just fly anywhere for £55. I think those days are probably over, because the airlines have got to survive. Swissport is within a couple of weeks, and they are ground handlers. If they've got no revenue coming in from handle aircraft, they won't exist anymore. So suddenly you've got everything which we've taken for granted, that stability,
Yes.
unraveling. And much of the assumption of economic wealth being generated by people doing things, much of it isn't going to happen in future, for the moment anyway.
Yes.
I'm quite pessimistic.
Yes, I was just about to say, so map it out for us. What do you think, what sort of post-COVID crisis world are we looking at in terms of our political system and the way we are being guided or not going into the future? Our Western societies I'm talking about now, just to keep it contained. And also our economic model. What do you expect? What do you think we should be prepared for?
Well, I think you make a flawed assumption, Patricia, I have to say, about your question, the post-COVID world. I think you have to accept, remember, it's COVID-19. That means there could easily be a COVID-20 or a COVID-21. The idea that this is just a passing phase, if it does happen like that, you'll be lucky. I think the assumption you've got to make, and as I mentioned with Singapore, down to their 4th wave already, probably the most controlled, and I say that in an affectionate way, one of the most controlled environments on our planet. If they are experiencing a 4th wave, we have to assume that as lockdowns are lifted, other waves are going to return, because that's the way COVID works. It's that brutal. David Nabarro, who is the senior envoy, British doctor who's been 45 years doing epidemiology, senior envoy to the World Health Organization, he says very clearly, based on the kind of evidence they're getting at WHO in Geneva, that we've now got to have a permanent COVID-ready state. That means the clamping down, the lockdowns needing to be imposed to stop it developing beyond the community in which COVID has been detected again. We haven't yet got to that stage because we haven't been through the lockdown stage. So I have to say, I think your assumption of a post-COVID world is wrong. It's got to be a living with COVID world.
Yes.
A living with COVID world.
Yeah.
Because of our title of Thinking the Unthinkable, Thinking the Unpalatable, I remain quite pessimistic that there are enough people out there to understand that this is an enormous challenge. It's an existential challenge. It's a challenge of the likes that almost no one on the world now has ever experienced. I'm old enough to remember the adversity of the Cold War, when we were threatened by Russian missiles and so on. Fortunately, we never actually had any war. No missiles were launched. But this is not a war. It's a wartime.
Yeah.
And wartime requires the loss of personal power, the increased level of government power, and new understandings of where wealth will be generated, which we've never even conceived. And I've seen people like Joe Stiglitz, the economics laureate, and many others saying we've now moved into an area where there's no knowledge. So you're asking me a question. If the economists don't know, and the economists always say they know nothing, but if economists don't know, then I certainly can't tell you, apart from the fact that everything that you and I and everyone watching this has assumed is going to be creating balance, equilibrium, and a degree of assurance. You cannot assume that. Make sure you are prepared for this environment, including not taking holidays, maybe just being, frankly, fortunate to be alive.
Yes, it is wonderful to have you that outspoken about something that nobody really would like to hear, the unpalatable indeed. And, the moment I opened your book, Thinking the Unthinkable, I already loved the actual headlines. And let me just name a couple of them. You stumble over it. The Black Swan, Black Elephants, and Black Jellyfish. These are all the events you can't really predict, and which seem to become the new normal. As you were just saying. The other one is, if you are not prepared, you're really going to get whacked. We are being whacked big time.
Look where we are now.
Not necessarily being prepared whatsoever. And even though we had SARS, we had MERS, we had other crises before, but spending not necessarily did go into healthcare and trying to look after the population also in that term, not only in terms of defense and defense spending. And then, I can't really say that, Nick, but wonderful title, You Up the World. Let's talk about fixing it. So wonderful to use the F word in that, and it is really, really true.
It didn't come from us. It came from the next generation, because we've got to think of the next generation. And in our book, we have two forwards. One from Lord Nick Stern, who's the great, I call him Lord Nick Stern of climate change. The other one is from Aniket Shah, a 29-year-old with a career of a 50-year-old, who says that the emperor has lost its clothes when it comes to the next generation understanding the enormity of what they're leaving for us. So this is not about a man with grey hair trying to write this stuff. This is about empowering and emboldening the next generation. They need to be heard at the table. They need to be heard at the table at the C-suite, cabinet level, and we say in our book that what you need is more mavericks. Mavericks need to be not just written off as a bloody nuisance.
Yes.
They've got to be seen as visionaries. People who are prepared to speak their minds, even if it means worrying about keeping their job. So it is about a change of mindset, culture, and behavior. It can be done, but it takes bravery and an admission and an awareness you may make mistakes, but you shouldn't be sacked for it. You should actually be encouraged for making mistakes, even if they're expensive mistakes, because at least you've tried to do something different.
And with that, I say thank you very much, Nik Gowing. You're saying the things the way they are, blunt, crude, candid, and this is exactly what we are all about here also on Mentorit TV. Thank you.
And I'd say we weren't outspoken. This is based on evidence from leaders who say it really is that difficult, even if it might sound outspoken. Thank you, Patricia.